I have tried hundreds of whiskies from around the world this year, and now I'm going to announce my World Whiskey of the Year for 2024. An explosion of whiskies from around the world, and I've made it my goal to try as many as possible and work out which whiskies you should buy and you shouldn't buy. I've kind of separated the videos. I'm gonna have my Whiskey of the Year video, and now this is gonna be my World Whiskey of the Year. These are the whiskies you might be walking past at your bottle store and you're like, should I try whiskey from Denmark, from Australia? Like, you're not quite sure. There's no Scotch whiskey in this one, but I think you'll be really interested. There's some surprising picks, some really interesting picks, and stuff you might not expect. So let's jump in. So I've hosted a bunch of whiskey tastings this year, and 2 tastings I did was about world whiskey, and I got hundreds of people to explore whiskies from around the world. And this bottle appeared on both lists. In fact, it's appeared on the online Scotch Whisky Awards, where thousands of whiskey enthusiasts have also raved about this whiskey. This whiskey is from India. I think a lot of you probably already know what this whiskey might be, and it's going to be the Injury. It's got great stats, non-chill filtered, no added colour, it's 46%. And what's really interesting about where this whiskey is from is the way the whiskey is aged is very different to Scotch. And I always compare it to, think of steak versus pulled pork. Scotch in Ireland are kind of like your pulled pork. The climate is cold, the casks breathe very slow. So that's why like the average kind of Scotch is like a 10-year-old. That's why with world whiskies, pretty much the majority of these whiskies I'm going to be talking about have no age statements, because the whole idea of comparing age statements doesn't make any sense. What I find happens in those younger whiskies where the casks breathe faster is often, rather than getting so much of the orchard fruit flavors, new world whiskies, I often find you get a lot more of those tropical fruits, as you'll see on my flavor tree. Shameless plug. Go check out my flavor tree if you haven't checked it out yet. Link in the bio or click the shop. And I had a tasting the other day, and a lot of people rated this their favorite whiskey of the entire lineup. What I would say as well is add a drop of water, let it breathe a bit. Sometimes that first sip can be a little bit harsh, but once you let it breathe, it's just a fantastic whiskey. The next whiskey on this list from a country which became very famous for whiskey, got really expensive, and then suddenly a lot of enthusiasts have kind of just not even thought about it for the last 10 years. But this whiskey is a whiskey that's very available. I'm pretty sure you'll be able to find it where you are too. It is going to be the Miyagikyo. And this is from Anika, which are one of the kind of 2 kind of original distilleries in Japan. It's 45%, doesn't say unchill filtered or natural color on it, but I'm pretty sure that's natural color. There's another one, which is the Yoichi, which is also very good. It's like a peaty version. If you just want to try like a quintessential Japanese whiskey, I often point people to this. It does very well at my tastings. The price is really good too. Just one side note, if you're in Japan or Taiwan, their tax rates are really good if you're ever visiting there. Go buy lots of Japanese whiskey, because it's going to be a lot more expensive in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and that sort of thing. But in recent years, the distilleries in Japan have upped production. I've definitely found prices starting to come down quite a lot, that Japanese whiskey is definitely back on the radar. And this one has some sherry cask influence. It actually says strong sherry cask influence, which is quite interesting. And I think it kind of reflects the way the Japanese make their whiskey, because when they say strong cask influence, I wouldn't say this is a sherry bomb. I just think it's like a good sherry cask whiskey. And I think that's kind of a difference between Scotch and Japanese whiskey. I find Japanese whiskey is very kind of like refined, and they get all the details, and it's always kind of that subtle complexity. Whereas Scotch is like smoke bomb, sherry bomb, funky farm bomb. Not all Scotch whiskey. You know, you can find these kind of extremes. Some of the best whiskeys you've ever had, also some terrible ones. But I always find with Japanese whiskey, like, it's pretty much always good. Let's jump into the next one, which I think is pretty surprising. The next runner-up is an Australian whiskey, but there are so many Australian whiskies I could have added that are good value, pretty valuable, and great for a whiskey enthusiast. I'm going to give you some quick runner-up. If you want to know more about my favorite Australian New Zealand whiskies, go watch the Australian whiskey video I did with Wade. Quite long, but I don't know, listen in the car as a podcast, or I don't know, get YouTube Premium and listen in your headphones or whatever. Anyway, first on the list is going to be the Cape Byron. I find if you're used to Scotch, you're used to Irish whiskey, a lot of people from Ireland and from Scotland get a bit scared with New World whiskey because there's a lot of ex-wine casks going around. But I feel like if you want to kind of sort of gently kind of get into, say, Australian whiskey, start with Cape Byron. Jim McEwen was involved in setting up this distillery. 47%, non-chill filtered, no added color, and just a fantastic whiskey. But really, my overall favorite Australian whiskey this year was kind of an interesting one. So the thing about this distillery is they actually are a vineyard and they specialize in fortified wine, which is perfect because so many whiskeys are aged in port cask, sherry cask, which are fortified wine. So the one I picked was this one here, the Morris Muscat Barrel. So this is aged in Australian fortified wine cask. This whiskey is fascinating. I often talk about how like bourbon's kind of flavor range is sort of like here. Scotch is kind of like here, and world whiskey is like here. The flavor difference of world whiskey is so extreme, and Morris is definitely one of those distilleries that are pushing out the edges. When I first tried it, I was like, I'm not sure about that, but it's like the same journey when I got into peated whiskey. The more I get through it, I went from like, oh, okay, this is all right. Yeah, I like, yeah, this is all right. And I'm like, oh, I actually enjoying this as much as a Bunnahabhain. And as I'm getting down, I'm like, I'm reaching for this. Like, this is nice. It's just like dark, really strong in the raisin note. In fact, what was really interesting, I've been trying to get my wife into whiskey for a long time, and I do these videos on like best whiskies for a beginner. I've given her like Glenmorangie 10, the Glenlivet 12, the Tamdhu 12, the Lafroig 10, the Redbreast 12, and she's like, nah, don't like it. The only two whiskies that she's like have been the Michter's Sour Mash and this one. They really show me that for someone who hasn't got into Scotch, hasn't got into bourbon, their palate hasn't got used to those flavor profiles. This actually came out top as something that she liked. And I think a lot of the problem is when a lot of bourbon drinkers and Scotch drinkers come to this, they're like, oh, this is different. And they don't give it the time. They taste it once and they think, I don't like Australian whiskey. And I actually don't think they've been sitting on it long enough. So in this video for the next runner-up, I'm going to choose my favorite rye and my favorite bourbon. So first of all, let's start with the rye. Historically, I have not liked rye whiskey. I thought they just taste like paint. Until I tried this, someone was like, you need to try the Sagamore Double Oak. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the Double Oak in New Zealand, but I could get the Sagamore Cask Strength. Especially for you in the Southern Hemisphere who are in summer now. Honestly, I can't think of a better whiskey in an old fashioned. I also love drinking it neat. It has this nice kind of like syrupy kind of sweetness. If you can pick up a rye, grab a Sagamore. Maybe you might even like a rye. So I did a video where you guys recommended the top bourbons for a Scotch lover, and what came out top was this one here. It's the Knob Creek 9. It's nutty. It is a decent age statement as well. It's like 9 years old. It's also 50%. So I feel like if you're gonna buy a bourbon and you just wanna get something that is that next level, it's not just your average Jim Beam, your average Jack Daniels, something with a little bit more complexity. I explored a lot of New Zealand whiskey this year, and I know some of you won't be able to get these, but honestly, New Zealand's one of the most like visited countries in the world. It's a huge tourist destination, so if you ever visit New Zealand, I do think this is still going to be relevant to you. If you have like a lot of money, you want to try the best New Zealand whiskey, go for the Cardrona. Look, they don't cut corners at Cardrona, but a lot of you are looking for whiskies in the same sort of price profile as like an Arran 10, a Bunnahabhain 12, a Deanston 12. Probably the distillery I'm most excited about is going to be the Waiheke Moss. The thing is, they had an old still, but they've just introduced a new still, which is this geodesic still. I've talked about it before. Honestly, I've tried the new make from their new still. It's fantastic. Now, there's one more whiskey I need to introduce you to, and it is what I call the Glenmorangie of New Zealand. They have the tallest stills. It's light, it's fruity, but if you want to try something really interesting, and it is the Pokeno Prohibition. 46% unchill filtered, natural color. It's finished in a porter cask, a dark beer. But I'm going to move on to what was my favorite New Zealand whiskey this year. And I find amongst New Zealand whiskey enthusiasts, this has just become basically the Arran 10 of New Zealand. And it is the 1919 Go Liter. So recently I was sent this. So this company basically make this whole collection of world whiskies. They basically pick whiskey from different distilleries from around the world, from Germany to Denmark to all sorts of places that I probably wouldn't normally have access to. There are a lot of whiskeys that honestly I just didn't like. I don't know how many drams were in that box, like over 30, and this came out number 1, and it's from Canada, the Macaloni's Canadian single malt peated whiskey. This one's bottled at 46%, non-chill filtered, no color added. It's aged in Portuguese red wine STR cask, smoked with Washington peat. But let's jump into the #1 whiskey, the World Whiskey of the Year. What was my favorite whiskey I had this year from around the globe? I think this might surprise some people. This was so hard to pick a winner, but when I tried this whiskey, it went straight to the top. And it just ticks all the boxes. It's available, it's good value. But my World Whiskey of the Year is gonna be this one here. It is the Cotswolds Peated Cask. When I was at Cotswolds, I sat down with Rob. We've got a video coming out. If it's already out, it'll be up here. Where basically I did a video on how whiskey is made. And he basically got me to try every whiskey from Cotswolds. I was like, this peated cask one is fantastic. It's so good.
Previous seasoning will be an additional flavor profile that the whiskey will be able to then utilize to create its own flavor.
Yeah, it's like you move into a flat and the previous owner's been a smoker or something. And this is still there.
Not as close.
It's not as romantic.
Really good analogy, because we actually have a cask that embodies that analogy. So these are ex-quarter casks. So essentially, yeah, the previous occupant was a smoker. But what you're gonna love about this is it's peated cask, not peated malt. So the nose to the palate disparity is huge.
So it's not a peated whiskey, but even just with a cask, as I find they are a very fruit-forward distillery, like it's that salt on top. It's also bottled at 60.4%, unchill filtered, natural color. It's very punchy, so probably add water to it. So my recent whiskey tasting, this was the favorite of the night, but I'm interested to what your favorite world whiskey is. I'd love to hear comments down below. If you haven't got yourself the flavor tree yet, I recommend you go grab that, and above all, make sure you share and enjoy.